Hello, Tony Wright, FLCC, A.B. Wright Ministries. This is our 90-day Bible study. We're on day 58. Finishing up the book of Jeremiah, we're rolling right on into the book of Lamentations. Now, as we approach the end of yesterday's reading, Jeremiah, he was trying to convince the remnant that survived in Jerusalem to not flee to Egypt. Now, God had told him that he would protect them there in Jerusalem, but they would be consumed if they left. Others in the group, though, they felt that the Chaldeans would kill them if they stayed, so they fled as Jeremiah continued to prophesy against them for this transgression. Then Jeremiah spoke forth messages against them, against their captives, against Egypt, and against Philistia. And as we enter into the reading for today, Jeremiah is still issuing spoken messages against the countries that God had foretold of specific punishment and convictions. Now, the first of those was concerning the Moabites. They lived east of the Jordan River, south of the Arnon River, and they were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Now, based on what's presented here in the text, the Moabites, they seem to have been allies of Judah, especially during this time of Jeremiah's ministry. Now, the oracle that's written against Moab is several paragraphs long, but the first paragraph describes increasing devastation. And Jeremiah, he foresaw the invaders pushing southward into Moab. And he had even heard the soldiers encouraging each other, saying, "Let us cut her off from being a nation." And he had heard the refugees crying as they fled from the invaders. Jeremiah, he issues an urgent appeal to Moab for the Moabites to flee because nothing would be able to save them. Not their strongholds, not their treasures, not even the God of their country. The destruction that was coming upon Moab was prophesied to be of God. And Moab had remained relatively undisturbed up to this point. Jeremiah said that like wine, though, that's allowed to sit too long in its sediment, they had become a strong and a proud culture. And the approaching judgment that would come to pour Moab out to the ground. And Moab's arrogance was an affront to God, and he declared that he must deal with it. Jeremiah said that the horn of Moab, which symbolizes power, and the arm, which symbolizes its authority, had been broken. And just like Moab had mocked Israel in this hour of humiliation, Moab would now be mocked. Now, Jeremiah, he was distressed to think that the beautiful vineyards and the land would be ruined and wine vats be empty, worship activities cease, gloom and despair be everywhere. He shared their agony. But still, he closed by emphasizing that Moab's destruction was just inescapable. He said that now the Chaldean flame would spread forth from Heshbon, which is a prediction of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Moab some 4 years after the fall of Jerusalem. Now, Jeremiah's next oracle was for Ammon. Rabbah, the capital of Ammon, and the satellite cities, they would all be destroyed. The worshippers of Malcham, the god of Ammon, they would go into exile, and Israel would be able to recover her lost territory. Jeremiah called upon the land of Ammon to lament because of this. Ammon prided herself in natural resources and treasures, but that false confidence would be shattered when God brought that fearful enemy up against them. Now, after the judgment, though, there would be a reversal of circumstances that would take place. Jeremiah issued his next oracle, though, against Edom. Jeremiah said that the enemy would do a more thorough job in devastating Edom than grape gatherers do to a vine, or that thieves do when they clear out a house. The warriors of Edom, they would be killed. But God, he would care for their orphans and the widows if they looked to him. Jeremiah had seen that God was stirring the nations to come up against Edom. And the Edomites, they would be taken captive, their land made desolate. Then Jeremiah spoke against Damascus. The enemy was approaching, and because the inhabitants of Damascus didn't flee, there was going to be great slaughter in Damascus. Jeremiah also urged Nebuchadnezzar's troops to plunder Kedar and other Arab tribes of the desert. all the treasures there would fall into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar. The prophet, he urged the Arabs to flee deep into the desert and for the attackers to go up and take the spoil from the Arab tribes. Now, although Jeremiah advocated submission to Babylon as this world power that's appointed by God, he was no Babylonian supporter. He regarded Nebuchadnezzar as only a tool which God was using for his divine purpose. Justice demanded that the Babylonians taste the wrath of God. The Oracle of Babylon, it started with contrast between the fate of Babylon and the future of Israel. The god of Babylon, Bel-Marduk, would be put to shame by the fall of this great sacred city. A nation coming from the north was going to wreak havoc upon the land. The entire place would become desolate. Now, in the time of Babylon's destruction, God's people would be delivered from captivity. Israel would flee Babylon in the hour of deliverance, and both Israel and Judah would join together in genuine repentance to return to Zion and to enter into this eternal covenant with God. At the same time, Babylon would be plundered by a company of great nations. Now, both Assyria and Babylon, like two mighty lions, each had devoured Israel. Assyria, though, had already fallen, and Babylon would soon fall as well. Then these scattered sheep of Israel would be able to return to the land of Canaan. In that day, God would pardon that remnant for the sins that had been committed against him. And Jewish captives would return to Zion to declare that the destruction of God's temple had been revenged. The covenant people, Israel, Judah, they had been in the grip of this Mesopotamian power, but their strong Redeemer was going to take over their case and put down these Babylonians. God would allow the sword and drought to destroy all of those who supported Babylon's power and their glory. And neither the waters that were surrounding Babylon nor those treasures that had been gathered by Nebuchadnezzar was going to be able to stop this disaster. The enemy was going to overwhelm this city, and the men, they would be helpless to resist against the forces that had been sent by the Almighty. Jeremiah, he referred to King Cyrus as God's battle axe. Nobody, no one, zero is going to be able to stand before him. And through him, Babylon was going to be repaid for all the evil that had been done against Zion. Oh, wait a minute. Lamentations, book of Lamentations. It doesn't specifically identify its author, but there is considerable external and internal evidence that points to Jeremiah as the writer of this book. Now, we certainly know that the prophet was acquainted with the techniques of lamentation, don't we? Boy, we just left the book of Jeremiah where he was engaged in one lament after another. Now, both Jewish and Christian tradition overwhelmingly assign lamentation to this famous prophet. Jeremiah, his ability for great outpourings of grief has, through the centuries, earned him the moniker of the weeping prophet. And their internal evidence of Jeremiah's authorship of this book is as strong as the external. The character and the spirit of the two books is the same. Both books full of sympathy for the people of God as they go through their hour of judgment. Both books attribute the destruction of Jerusalem to the sin of the people. Now, each of the chapters in Lamentations is an independent composition. Yet, there's a certain pattern in the arrangement of these chapters, and it's clear. Well, in chapter 1 and 2, each three-line stanza begins with the succeeding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In chapter 3, all 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, they appear at the beginning of verses 3 times in succession. Now, Lamentations is entirely poetry. But it's not poetry of rhyme, but it's poetry of thought. The second or third lines of a verse will either repeat the thought of the first line, it'll build on the thought of the first line, or it'll state a contrast to the thought of the first line. Now, the first part of Lamentations from today's reading talks about a widowed city. The poem has 2 units. In the first, the prophet laments the destruction of Jerusalem. And in the second unit, the city laments its own fate. Both units, though, end in prayers which call upon God to execute vengeance on the enemies of Zion. Jeremiah, he described Jerusalem as a widowed princess who sat alone in the night weeping over the loss of her husband and her children. Once, she was a princess among provinces. Now, she had become just a forced laborer. And Judah had been carried away to harsh servitude among the nations. So Zion was widowed spiritually as well as politically. The city gates, which once had bristled with business during the festival season, they were now desolate. Zion was also widowed psychologically. Zion's miserable present was made all the worse when she remembered that all her wonderful privileges were once hers as God's chosen city. Even Zion herself couldn't stand the sight of her own corruption. And during that period of her prosperity, she had given no thought to the ultimate consequences of her evil ways. She had stubbornly refused to believe God's warnings through his servants, the prophets. And in arrogant pride, Zion had regarded herself as God's favorite, a city that was exempt from the accountability that was required of any other city. So to be sure, Zion's end, it came as a total shock. This is what made the fall of Jerusalem so terrible. The poet, though, he summarized the plight of the widow Zion. All the gracious gifts that God had bestowed on Zion had now fallen into hands of the enemy. Jeremiah called on God to take note of the misery of his people and the distress even of this prophet. Jeremiah now illustrated the lonely, tearful widow Zion, taking up her lament in three ways. First, she appealed for sympathy to passersby. Zion's agony was all the worse because none of the travelers who passed Jerusalem seemed to realize the depths of her agony. She complained bitterly that no other city had suffered what she had suffered. The paragraph, though, ends as it began, with a note that there is no comforter. Second, Zion appealed to the neighboring nations. She spread forth her hands in a pitiful gesture of solicitation, but there was no comforter. Neighboring nations by now had become her enemies. The city of Zion now was regarded as something filthy. Yet, as harsh as this suffering was, it was justly deserved because the city had rebelled against God. God was righteous in executing this judgment. Finally, the weeping widow turned her eyes heavenward and presented a petition before God. Her heart was now contrite, and she accepted her punishment. And this appeal to God was really just a plea for mercy. Whoa, I have a plea too. That you just keep reading this word, you keep checking us out on your favorite social media platform, and tell your friends, tell your neighbors, FLCC, we're on the move. We're taking ministry back to the first love. Peace.